This view of multiculturalism was also explored and defended more fully by Lord Swan in his appropriately titled report called Education for All. It is also in consonance with our own practices, such as involving all major religious communities in national ceremonies and events, or as reflected in Prince Charles's remark that if he became king, he wished to be defender of faith rather than the faith. I want to maintain that multiculturalism understood in this way has served Britain well. It has reassured minorities that they need not fear aggressive cultural assimilation. And it has averted the siege mentality amongst minorities that their French counterparts have felt. It has also at the same time reassured the majority community that it need not fear loss of its historically inherited identity or its control over its own affairs. It has also led to greater cultural sensitivity, and that has improved the language of public discourse. In France, for example, even now its immigrants are often told, go back to your country. Or in Germany, you would have seen recently Mesut Ozil, who was a star soccer player in the German team which won. Even when he's integrated, he is referred to quite often as a plastic German. That is a manufactured German, not the authentic original German, because he was not born of German parents. This kind of language, I suggest, would be unthinkable in today's Britain. And we need to ask how and why that kind of cultural sensitivity has developed. Or even taking an example from our own country. But 25 years ago, it was quite common for politicians, especially the likes of Mrs. Thatcher, to talk about our kith and kin abroad, meaning our kith and kin in Australia and New Zealand. That too would sound very strange and bizarre today, and we need to ask why. What has changed such that the idea of referring to our kith and kin in Australia or New Zealand would sound utterly improper without anyone having legislated against it? Having learned to respect our own minorities and cultures settled in our midst, we have also become more sensitive to other societies in our globalizing multicultural world, and we display less of the old imperial hubris. David Cameron, when he went to India in his speech, and the High Commissioner would correct me if I am wrong, said, I have come to this country in great humility, in the spirit of wanting to learn. What he learned, I am not sure, but the whole language would have been unthinkable. And the same sort of thing he said more recently in during his visit to China. I would even, therefore, be tempted to conclude that our multiculturalism, as we have defined it in our report, has improved not only our cuisine and our arts and literature, but also our manners and to some extent our morals or moral attitudes. Now, as I said earlier, multiculturalism involves balancing diversity and commonality, such that diversity facilitates integration and comes to be cherished as our collective moral and cultural capital. Now, that balance is not always easy to strike. Sometimes there is a tendency to go too far in one direction or the other, and that has happened with us too. Sometimes we have gone too far in the direction of diversity, panicked and swung to the other extreme. Sometimes we did the opposite. We insisted on conformity where it was not necessary. Protests came, and we swung back to a more balanced position. This is an inevitable part of the process of learning how to strike a right balance. Nations learn as do individuals. After all, this is a new experience in human history for all societies, because all societies are multicultural, and they all need to find ways of reconciling these two conflicting demands. And occasional mistakes are bound to occur. But the answer lies not in rejecting multiculturalism, because there is simply no moral or political alternative. The answer lies rather in finding a better way of balancing the demands of unity and diversity. Because the only alternative that I can think of is the French model. And so that's not viable, as the French themselves are beginning to realize. And if pushed too far, it can lead to a situation where you can't wear a hijab or a burqa on the bus or in the public square or when you are shopping. That is the logic of that kind of argument. Angela Merkel recently said that multiculturalism had failed in Germany. And when I looked at her speech and asked myself what is the evidence on which it is based, I found that she was pointing to two things. First, that the Turkish immigrants are not learning German. Well, I've asked myself what that has got to do with multiculturalism. Because in all educational institutions, it is to be expected that people would learn the local language. And she also said, secondly, that multiculturalism has failed because it had led to ghettos. But the ghettos didn't arise simply because people were multicultural. Ghettos arose because of economic disadvantages. In Britain also, I think there is a tendency to blame multiculturalism for all kinds of things. Some genuine, because they point out to certain mistakes that we have occasionally made in going too far in the direction of diversity. But I cannot see, as I said earlier, any kind of alternative to the need to balance appropriately the demands of diversity and unity. Sometimes we are told, and this brings me to my third issue that is coming up in Britain, has to do with the problems of terrorism. Now, this is a difficult issue, and I want to deal with it only insofar as it is associated with some form of multiculturalism. Terrorism of a small group of young Muslims needs to be placed in a social and cultural context. Young Muslims underachieve educationally and are among the poorest. Over half of them live in areas with the most deprived housing conditions, compared to 20% of the total population, and their unemployment rate is twice the national average. Nearly 70% of Muslim children live in poverty and receive state support, and some 36% of them leave school without qualifications. These socio-economic disadvantages are compounded by the experiences of discrimination and marginalization. Young Muslims are also alienated from their parental culture, which they either do not understand or find conservative, backward, restrictive, and not a source of pride. There is often limited emotional intimacy between parents and children, and very little meaningful conversation. Not surprisingly, many parents and elderly family members admit ignorance of what their younger members are thinking or feeling or doing, as was confirmed in the case of some of those involved in the London terrorist attacks in July 2005. So, detached from their parental and British cultures, alienated young Muslims tend to form their own groups based on a shared subculture of defiance and victimhood. Some turn to drug trafficking, prostitution, gang welfare, warfare, and petty crimes. It is striking that young Muslims form 9% of the prison population, which is considerably higher than amongst their white counterparts. Many of those who avoid crime turn to Islam to give them a sense of dignity and identity, a particularly noticeable trend among college and university students. Freed from the ethnic, national, and other ties and turning to religion as the sole basis of their identity, young Muslims are available for mobilization by militant groups with a global agenda. The pursuit of global causes gives them a sense of power, a purpose, a thrill, a sense of belonging, and a ready network of support and friends. The biased Western foreign policies, the invasion of Iraq, and the scandals of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay give their anger a moral edge and intensify their sense of victimhood. Reclaiming Muslim youth, so I would suggest that the causes of the problem have to do not only with their socio-economic factors, but also with the way in which Islam has come to be defined among some young Muslim youth, and also the way in which they live in a world of their own where they are cut off both from the parental culture and from the British culture. Now, reclaiming Muslim youth requires addressing these and other factors, and is the joint responsibility of both Muslim communities and the wider societies. I want now to turn to the third question that I think also requires quite a bit of attention. And that has to do with our shared identity, or what is clumsily called Britishness. The Prime Minister put the point well when he said in the recent speech, and I quote, "Just as Britons change, so subtly will Britishness." When outsiders come to settle in a country, the identity of that country can no longer remain the same.